doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
Thank you very much, Hubert. I will keep these comments fairly brief. Let me start at a more macro level. So, in terms of things, so looking at across the continent, there are high levels of indebtedness, and so the firepower that central banks and governments have is fairly limited. So, whilst we've seen at 5% of GDP in developed markets, I'm just looking at the latest data. And that's at best is 2 to 3% across the continent. Egypt is 2.54% of GDP stimulus. Morocco 2.7, and we've seen some actions from central banks. So Ayman said, I think 3% of base rate in Egypt, for example. So debt relief is going to be hugely important to create some flexibility within that. So that's going to be, there isn't much capacity there. And the IMF firepower, well, that it seems to me that there are very few qualifiers for that. So it is going to be of limited application in terms of that. So that leads you on to the point again Ayman made about if you like, on the equity side, and this is where a kind of a version of quantitative easing, but focused on those businesses that otherwise would be just racking up debt. And I think this is a really crucial point that sovereign wealth funds can come to the table with, which is about that as the vehicle that will allow that to happen. Because it isn't about nationalisation taking control, rather it's about a transit for these difficult times that allows those businesses to still function, especially in the strategic areas, as Ayman said in those terms. Now, just as a useful piece of context, in terms of any conversations, there is an intellectual underpinning to this that is quite useful. I'll happily share. There's an IMF paper which is something around called sovereign asset and liability management. And it's a whole macroeconomic framework that looks both at assets and the typical asset side of the business of a national balance sheet, but also does look at government liabilities quite specifically as well. It's quite useful if there is that intellectual underpinning that anybody needs in an argument. So I would go back to what Ayman said about sovereign wealth funds as a vehicle for this particular period to get us through the next quarter and the next 6 months, especially in those strategic industries. There's a big role to play there. And then the other point I would pick up is the point Solomon made, which is about co-investment. Just as I think similar to Ghana, we've seen NIIF of India, and before that CDP in Italy and RDIF in Russia. They're almost acting as state-sponsored private equity organizations and attracting in external capital. And playing to the point that was been made about pension funds, what do they need to bring them into these investments? And the other point I just wanted to make, which was about, and this is about the real economy, playing to the real economy of Africa. The relationship with China is going to change from a number of countries. And this isn't advocating it. This is not a Trump-style point. But what has been showed is just that China and the concentration of supply in China, as people are going to appreciate, does not make strategic long-term sense. So there will undoubtedly be a push for greater diversification of supply chain, in some cases rehousing it in the home country. But there will look to be more diversification, and that will be an opportunity for various countries across the continent. I'll probably leave it there just to say that looking at in terms of central banks, understanding where the support there needs to be debt relief. There is intellectual underpinning for sovereign wealth funds to have a more active role, and that is endorsed to an extent by the IMF, so that can be useful in conversations. And then what we have in a number of cases, Egypt's one, I've seen the news from Turkey as well. That's a good example of another country where sovereign wealth fund that help in this immediate period. So let me leave it at that point.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.